Hello. Reflection on the call of Moses, a moment of worship. Exodus chapter 3, verses 1 to 12. Let's listen to the passage. Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian. He led his flock beyond the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. Then the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of a bush. He looked, and the bush was blazing, but it was not consumed. Then Moses said, I must turn aside and look at this great sight and see why the bush is not burned up. When the Lord saw that he had turned aside to see, God called him out of the bush, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here I am. Then he said, Come no closer. Remove the sandals from your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. He said further, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. Then the Lord said, I have observed the misery of my people who are in Egypt. I have heard their cry on account of their taskmasters. Indeed, I know their sufferings. And I have come down to deliver them from the Egyptians, and to bring them up out of the land to a good and broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey, to the country of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. The cry of the Israelites has now come to me. I have also seen how the Egyptians oppress them. So come, I will send you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. But Moses said to God, Who am I, that I could go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? He said, I will be with you. And this shall be the sign for you, that it is I who sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall worship God on this mountain. Amen. Remove the sandals from your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. Moses is out working. He is a shepherd and looking after sheep belonging to his father-in-law Jethro, when he notices a burning bush and goes over to take a closer look. Unexpectedly, he finds himself in God's presence. This was not what he was looking for, not what he was expecting, but he finds himself at worship. About 15 years ago, the Church Mission Society ran its Holy Ground project. It was a collection of shoes and stories from Christians all around the world. Each person donated a pair of shoes and offered a brief statement, a brief story of what following Christ meant for them. We copied the idea in some alternative worship in one of the churches of which I was then minister in Birmingham. We invited folk to take off their shoes so that we could photograph them. And then we printed the photographs and invited each owner of shoes to just write a few sentences about their journey of following Christ. And it was interesting to notice how many chose to write about where those shoes had been with them. It was certainly an interesting and actually quite moving experience. we know that we can meet God anywhere. You don't have to go to the specified holy place. But that doesn't mean that there is no point in having those special places. There are places where we find it easier to encounter God. It might be a church or a cathedral. It might be a place with particular associations, a special place for us, or maybe somewhere that's really known for being special, like Iona or Lindisfarne. At the moment, we are being reminded that we can meet God at home, because that is the only place we can go. And of course, God will come to us where we are. That's for sure. Location can help, but it certainly isn't crucial. Moses noticed the burning bush. And that's interesting. I fear that sometimes we miss God because we don't notice, because we don't have our eyes open. And then it's also important to notice the transforming nature of the encounter. We're not going to be the same when we have encountered God. It's going to make a difference in our lives. We might not like what it does, at least initially. Moses, of course, did not want to do what God asked of him. He strung together a whole list of excuses, and they were patiently answered by God. Perhaps there's a warning to notice here. Don't go to worship unless you're prepared for God to make a difference in your life. And then a third point of interest for me is that though Moses' interest was aroused by the burning bush, so that he had to go over and see what was going on, when he realized that God was there, he hid his face. God was too special, too awesome, too great for Moses to take a look. We too need to come before God with reverence. God is holy. God reaches out to us as he did to Moses, but we need to give God the respect and the honour that is his due. And so a very ordinary day for Moses becomes a totally transforming one. His encounter with God, his moment of worship, set him on an entirely different path. That's not what will happen every time we worship, but it is something that might happen any time we worship. Would that we were in church, that we went to church wondering what was going to happen. If this is going to be the day, wondering how God is going to surprise us today, intrigued by how we will be changed by the particular moment of worship. And that, of course, goes for all worship. Moses is told to remove his sandals because he is standing on holy ground. Moses was probably used to taking off his sandals in all sorts of situations. But he hadn't recognised this as being a holy place. He was just curious about the burning bush. Does God ever surprise us by pointing out that we too apparently are in an unexpectedly holy place? I suspect God does. The holy place is the place where we encounter God. Are we ready for that wherever it is, whatever time it happens? Are we ready to hear the voice of God? There is no indication in our text that Moses had ever encountered God before. But now, suddenly, he finds himself being being called to take on a massive job for God. And unsurprisingly, he has got a bunch of questions and a string of excuses. What are we going to do with those difficult things that God wants us to do? What are we going to do when we find ourselves standing on holy ground? That's a thought, isn't it? God bless you.